The entire shopping mall had fallen silent. Not the comfortable silence of a Sunday morning, but the awkward, tense silence that comes when something unexpected is about to happen. In the center of the gleaming marble atrium, surrounded by luxury stores with price tags that could feed a family for months, sat a man who clearly didn't belong. His clothes were worn and dirty. His beard was long and unkempt. His hands, calloused and scarred, hovered over the keys of a grand piano that had been installed just days earlier as part of the mall's new cultural initiative. Those hands were shaking. Marcus Webb was homeless. He'd been living under a bridge for 3 years. And right now he was about to do something that terrified him more than anything he'd faced in 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. He was about to play piano in front of hundreds of people. Most of them were staring at him with disgust, some with pity, a few with outright hostility. One man in particular, Brandon Hayes, owner of the most expensive watch store in the mall, was already pulling out his phone to call security. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would expose a truth that nobody expected, a truth that would go viral across the entire nation, a truth that would force everyone in that mall, especially Brandon Hayes, to confront something they'd spent their whole lives trying to ignore. This is the story of how one moment changed everything, how one song revealed a past that nobody knew, and how the man everyone dismissed as worthless turned out to be the most valuable person in the room. To understand what happened that day, you need to understand who Marcus Webb was. More importantly, you need to understand who he used to be. Because the man sitting at that piano, the man with dirt under his fingernails and holes in his shoes, hadn't always been homeless. He hadn't always been broken. There was a time when Marcus Webb had everything. A wife, a daughter, a future. But life has a way of taking everything from you when you least expect it. Marcus was 42 years old, though he looked closer to 60. 3 years of sleeping rough does that to a person. The streets age you in ways that time alone never could. Every night under that bridge, listening to the traffic overhead, Marcus would close his eyes and remember what it felt like to be warm, to be safe, to be loved. And every morning he would wake up and face another day of invisibility. Because that's what homelessness does. It makes you invisible. People look right through you. They step around you. They pretend you don't exist. But Marcus had found one place where he felt visible again. One place where for just a few moments each day he could forget about the cold and the hunger and the constant fear. The Riverside Mall had recently installed a beautiful Steinway grand piano in the center atrium. It was part of a new initiative by the mall's management to create a more cultured, upscale atmosphere. Anyone was welcome to play it, the signs said. Of course, when they wrote those signs, they weren't thinking about people like Marcus. He'd discovered the piano 3 weeks earlier, on a morning when he'd been walking through the mall to get warm. It was 5:30 in the morning and the shops weren't open yet, but the mall itself opened early for walkers. Marcus had seen the piano from across the atrium, and something inside him had stirred. A memory. A longing. A ghost of the person he used to be. He'd walked over slowly, looking around to make sure nobody was watching. And then, just for a moment, he'd let his fingers touch the keys. The feeling had been electric. Even without pressing down, even without making a sound, just the touch of those ivory keys against his fingertips had awakened something in him that he'd thought was dead forever. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus had felt like a human being again. Not a problem to be solved. Not an eyesore to be removed. But a person. A person with a past. A person with talent. A person who mattered. After that first morning, Marcus came back every day. Always early, always careful not to draw attention. He would sit at the piano for just a few minutes, touching the keys, remembering what it felt like to play. Sometimes he would press down very softly, so softly that the sound was barely audible, and play a few notes of a melody. But he never stayed long. He couldn't risk getting kicked out. He couldn't risk losing this one small piece of joy in his otherwise unbearable life. But there was someone who had noticed Marcus. Someone who found his presence deeply offensive. Someone who saw Marcus not as a human being, but as a threat to the carefully constructed image of success and prosperity that the Riverside Mall represented. That someone was Brandon Hayes. Brandon owned Timeless Elegance, a luxury watch store that catered to the kind of people who thought nothing of spending $50,000 on a timepiece. Brandon was 35 years old, impeccably dressed, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He'd built his business from nothing, and he was proud of that fact. He'd worked hard for everything he had, and he had no patience for people who, in his view, hadn't done the same. When Brandon looked at Marcus, he didn't see a fellow human being. He saw failure. He saw laziness. He saw everything he'd fought his entire life not to become. And Brandon Hayes was about to make sure that Marcus Webb knew exactly where he belonged, which was anywhere but here. Marcus Webb was born on a cold November morning in Detroit, Michigan. The year was 1982, and America was in the grip of a recession. His father, Robert Webb, worked at the Ford plant, doing back-breaking work for barely enough money to keep the family afloat. His mother, Linda, was a music teacher at the local elementary school. They lived in a small house on the east side, in a neighborhood where gunshots at night were more common than birdsong in the morning. But inside that small house, there was magic. Because Linda Webb had a piano. It wasn't a Steinway. It wasn't even close. It was an old upright that she'd bought at a yard sale for $200 with keys that stuck and strings that buzzed. But to young Marcus, it was the most beautiful thing in the world. From the time he was 4 years old, he would sit next to his mother on the piano bench and watch her fingers dance across the keys. She would play Chopin and Beethoven and Mozart, transforming their tiny living room into a concert hall. And Marcus would listen mesmerized. By the time he was 6, Marcus could play simple melodies by ear. By 8, he was composing his own songs. His mother recognized his gift immediately. She'd taught hundreds of children over her career, but she'd never seen natural talent like this. Marcus didn't just play the piano. He understood it. He could hear a piece of music once and reproduce it perfectly. He could feel the emotion behind the notes and translate it through his fingers. Linda began giving him lessons every day after school, pushing him harder than she pushed any of her other students. Because she knew that music could be Marcus's way out, his escape from the poverty and violence that surrounded them. But life in Detroit was hard. When Marcus was 10 years old, his father was injured in an accident at the plant. A piece of machinery malfunctioned, crushing Robert's left hand. The injury ended his career. The workers' compensation barely covered the medical bills, let alone the family's living expenses. Robert fell into a deep depression. He started drinking. The house that had once been filled with music became filled with arguments and the sound of bottles breaking. Linda took on extra students to make ends meet. She worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, teaching piano to children whose parents could afford to pay. She came home exhausted every night, but she still found time to work with Marcus. Because Marcus was special. Marcus was going to make it. He was going to be everything that she and Robert hadn't been able to be. When Marcus was 13, Linda entered him into a statewide piano competition. It was being held at the Detroit Symphony Hall, and the grand prize was a full scholarship to the Michigan School of Music. Linda worked overtime for months to save up the entry fee. She bought Marcus a second-hand suit that was too big for him. She braided his hair and polished his shoes until they gleamed. And on the day of the competition, she sat in the audience and prayed. Marcus played Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. It's a technically demanding piece full of thunderous chords and delicate passages that require perfect control. Marcus played it flawlessly. The judges were stunned. A 13-year-old kid from the east side of Detroit with no formal training beyond what his mother had given him, playing like a concert pianist. Marcus won first place. The scholarship was his. But 3 weeks later, Marcus's father died. Robert Webb had been drinking heavily for years, and his body finally gave out. Heart attack. He was 41 years old. The funeral costs wiped out what little savings Linda had managed to accumulate, and Marcus's world fell apart. He tried to keep playing. He started attending the Michigan School of Music on his scholarship, but everything had changed. His mother was working herself to death trying to keep them housed and fed. The guilt ate at Marcus. Here he was spending hours every day practicing piano, while his mother cleaned houses on the weekends to make rent. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel fair. When Marcus was 18, his mother collapsed during one of her lessons. Stroke. She died 3 days later in the hospital with Marcus holding her hand. He'd been accepted to the Juilliard School in New York. Full scholarship. His mother's dream for him had come true. But with her gone, the dream felt meaningless. Marcus couldn't go to Juilliard. He couldn't leave Detroit when his mother's body was barely cold in the ground. He couldn't spend 4 years studying music when he needed to survive. So he did what thousands of young men in his situation do. He walked into a military recruitment office and signed up. The Army would give him structure, purpose, a paycheck, a way to escape the memories that haunted him every time he looked at a piano. Marcus Webb was deployed to Afghanistan 6 months after he enlisted. He was 19 years old, and he'd never been more than 100 miles from Detroit. Now he was half a world away, carrying an M4 rifle through mountains and deserts, watching for enemies who could be anywhere. The work was hard, and the danger was real, but Marcus was good at it. He followed orders. He kept his head down. He looked out for his fellow soldiers. And slowly, very slowly, he began to build a new life. It was during his second deployment that Marcus met Sarah. She was a medic, tough and smart and beautiful. She'd grown up in Texas, the daughter of a Baptist preacher, and she'd joined the Army to pay for medical school. She and Marcus bonded over their shared dreams of a different life. They talked about what they'd do when they got out. Marcus told her about the piano, about the music he used to play. Sarah told him about the clinic she wanted to open someday back in her hometown, serving people who couldn't afford health care. They fell in love in the middle of a war zone. They got married at a small ceremony on base with their unit serving as witnesses. And when Sarah got pregnant, they both knew it was time to think about going home. They'd done their service. They'd earned their benefits. It was time to start the life they'd been dreaming about. Marcus left the Army after 6 years of service. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and earned several commendations for his bravery. He had PTSD, like most soldiers who'd seen combat, but he thought he could handle it. He and Sarah moved to a small town in Pennsylvania, where Sarah got a job at the local hospital. Marcus found work at a warehouse. They had a daughter, Rachel, who had her mother's smile and her father's eyes. For the first time since his mother died, Marcus was happy, but the PTSD was worse than he'd admitted. The nightmares came every night, the flashbacks during the day, The constant feeling of being on edge, waiting for something terrible to happen. Marcus started having panic attacks at work. He couldn't focus. He couldn't sleep. He started self-medicating with alcohol just like his father had done. Sarah tried to help. She begged him to see a therapist to get treatment through the VA. But Marcus was too proud, too ashamed. He'd survived a war. He should be able to handle this. When Rachel was 8 years old, Sarah was diagnosed with breast cancer, stage 4. By the time they caught it, it had already spread to her lymph nodes. She fought for 2 years going through chemotherapy and radiation while still working as many hours as she could to keep their insurance. Marcus watched the love of his life waste away. He felt completely helpless. All of his military training, all of his strength, and there was nothing he could do to save her. Sarah died on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Rachel was 10 years old. Marcus was 33. And something inside him broke completely. He couldn't take care of Rachel. He could barely take care of himself. The PTSD and grief had turned him into someone he didn't recognize. He was drinking heavily, having violent nightmares, screaming in his sleep. Rachel was terrified of him. Social services got involved, and one day they took Rachel away. They placed her with a foster family 50 miles away. They told Marcus it was temporary, just until he got help, just until he got better. But Marcus didn't get better. He fell apart completely. He lost his job. He lost his apartment. He lost everything. And eventually he ended up on the streets with nothing but the clothes on his back and memories that wouldn't let him rest. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of surviving. 3 years of being invisible. 3 years of wishing he was dead. But through it all, Marcus never forgot about the piano, about the music, about the one thing that had once made him feel alive. And when he saw that Steinway in the mall, something stirred in him that he thought was gone forever. A tiny spark of hope, a whisper of the person he used to be. And that's why, despite everything, despite the fear and the shame and the knowledge that he didn't belong, Marcus kept coming back to that piano. Because for just a few minutes each day, when his fingers touched those keys, he wasn't a homeless veteran. He wasn't a failure. He wasn't invisible. He was Marcus Webb. Pianist, son of Linda, husband of Sarah, father of Rachel. He was human again. It was a Tuesday morning when everything started to change. Marcus had slipped into the mall at 5:45, his usual time. The security guards knew him by now. They'd been told to keep an eye on him, but as long as he didn't cause trouble, they left him alone. Marcus made his way across the empty atrium to the piano. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the skylight, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Marcus sat down on the bench. His heart was pounding like it always did. He looked around to make sure nobody was watching. Then, very carefully, he placed his hands on the keys. He didn't press down immediately. He just let them rest there, feeling the cool smoothness of the ivory. This moment, this anticipation, was almost as good as actually playing, because in this moment, anything was possible. In this moment, he could pretend that he was about to perform at Carnegie Hall, that his mother was in the audience watching with pride, that Sarah and Rachel were waiting for him backstage. Marcus closed his eyes and pressed down gently. The sound that emerged was soft, almost tentative. Middle C, then D, then E. A simple scale played so quietly that it barely echoed in the vast space. But to Marcus, it was everything. He let his fingers move across the keys, playing fragments of melodies. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Debussy's Clair de Lune, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, pieces his mother had taught him so many years ago. His fingers remembered even when his mind tried to forget. He was so lost in the music that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching. He didn't notice the man standing 20 feet away, watching him with an expression of pure disgust. Brandon Hayes had come to the mall early to deal with some inventory issues at his store. He'd noticed the homeless man at the piano several times before, and each time it had irritated him. But today something about the scene pushed him over the edge. Maybe it was the stress of running the business. Maybe it was the argument he'd had with his girlfriend the night before. Or maybe it was something deeper, something he didn't want to examine too closely. Brandon strode forward, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. Marcus heard the footsteps and immediately stopped playing. His hands froze on the keys. He looked up and saw Brandon standing there, arms crossed, face set in an expression of contempt. "What do you think you're doing?" Brandon's voice was cold and sharp. Marcus didn't answer. He slowly pulled his hands away from the piano and started to stand up. "I asked you a question," Brandon said. "What are you doing? Just playing," Marcus said quietly. His voice was rough from disuse. He didn't talk to many people these days. Playing, Brandon repeated his voice, dripping with sarcasm. "You think this piano is for you? You think a mall like this wants homeless people sitting at a $30,000 piano?" Marcus felt his face flush with shame. He'd known this would happen eventually. He'd known he didn't belong here. But the words still stung. "The sign says anyone can play, Marcus," said his voice barely above a whisper. Brandon laughed. It was a cruel laugh, completely devoid of humor. "Anyone," he said. "Right. They mean anyone who's actually a patron of this mall. Anyone who might actually buy something. Not someone who's going to drive away customers because they can't stand the smell." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He knew he smelled bad. He hadn't had a real shower in a week. The shelter he sometimes stayed at had limited facilities, and there was always a line. He'd done his best to clean up using the sink in the mall bathroom, but there was only so much you could do. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. He started to move away from the piano. "I'll go." "Yeah, you will," Brandon said. He pulled out his phone. "And if I see you here again, I'm calling the cops. This mall doesn't need your type hanging around. It's bad for business. People come here to shop, not to be panhandled by losers who can't get their lives together." Marcus flinched at the word loser. Because that's what he was, wasn't he? A loser. A failure. A man who'd had everything and thrown it all away. He walked quickly toward the exit, his head down, his hands shaking. Behind him, he could hear Brandon talking to someone on his phone, probably security. Marcus didn't look back. He just kept walking until he was outside, back on the street where he belonged. But as he walked, something inside him felt different. Not broken. Not defeated. Angry. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus felt anger instead of shame. Who was Brandon Hayes to tell him he didn't belong? Who was anyone to decide that Marcus had no right to touch a piano? The sign said anyone could play. Anyone. Marcus had served his country. He'd lost everything in the process. And he'd be damned if some rich store owner was going to take away the one small piece of joy he had left. Marcus made a decision. He was going to keep coming back. He was going to play that piano. And if Brandon Hayes had a problem with that, then Brandon Hayes could go to hell. Over the next week, a pattern developed. Marcus would come to the mall early in the morning. He'd sit at the piano and play, always softly, always carefully. And Brandon would show up and harass him. Sometimes Brandon would just glare at him from across the atrium. Other times he'd come over and make snide comments. He'd complained to security. He'd complained to mall management. He made it his personal mission to make Marcus's life as miserable as possible. But Marcus kept coming back. And each time he played a little longer, a little louder, a little more confidently, because something was awakening inside him, something that had been dormant for 3 years, a sense of purpose, a sense of dignity, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he was worth something after all. It was during this time that Marcus met Father Thomas. The old priest was 73 years old, with white hair and kind eyes. He ran St. Michael's Church just 3 blocks from the mall. Father Thomas had been a chaplain in Vietnam back in the 60s. He knew what war did to people. He knew what trauma looked like. And when he saw Marcus sitting on a bench outside the mall one afternoon, he recognized a fellow veteran. "Mind if I sit?" Father Thomas asked. Marcus shrugged. People usually didn't ask. They just avoided him. Father Thomas sat down with a small grunt. His knees weren't what they used to be. For a few minutes, neither man spoke. They just sat there watching people walk by. Finally, Father Thomas said, "You play beautifully." Marcus looked at him, surprised. "You heard me? I was in the mall yesterday morning," Father Thomas said. "I heard you playing Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat, one of my favorites." Marcus didn't know what to say. Nobody had complimented his playing in over a decade. "I'm Father Thomas," the priest said, extending his hand. "I run St. Michael's down the street." Marcus shook his hand. "Marcus Webb. You a veteran?" "Marcus Army," Marcus said. "Afghanistan, 2 tours." Father Thomas nodded. "Vietnam. 1 tour. Long time ago now, but I remember." He paused. "You dealing with some rough stuff?" Marcus almost laughed. "Rough stuff. That was one way to put it." "Yeah," he said. "You could say that. You know about the VA services, they got programs now. For PTSD, for housing, for I know," Marcus interrupted. He'd heard it all before. "It's complicated." Father Thomas nodded again. He didn't push. "Well," he said, standing up slowly, "if you ever need a place to play piano, St. Michael's has an old upright in the sanctuary. Nothing fancy, but it works. I'm there most evenings around 7. Door's always open." He handed Marcus a card with the church's address and phone number. Then he walked away, leaving Marcus sitting on the bench, staring at the card in his hand. That evening, Marcus went to St. Michael's. The church was small and modest, nothing like the grand cathedrals he'd seen in pictures. But it was warm and quiet. And there in the corner of the sanctuary was an upright piano, just like the one his mother used to have. Father Thomas was sitting in one of the pews reading a book. He looked up when Marcus came in. "Glad you came," he said. "Feel free to play as long as you like." Marcus sat down at the piano. The keys were yellowed with age, and some of them stuck a little. But when he played, the sound was rich and full. For the next 2 hours, Marcus played everything he could remember. All the pieces his mother had taught him, all the songs he'd written as a teenager, all the melodies that had kept him company during his darkest nights in Afghanistan. When he finally stopped, his fingers were sore and his heart was full. Father Thomas was still sitting in the pew, listening. "You have a gift, son," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. It had been so long since anyone had seen him as anything other than a problem. So long since anyone had treated him with kindness. "Thank you," he whispered. "Come back any time," Father Thomas said. "And Marcus, that gift you have, it's not just for you. It's meant to be shared." Those words stayed with Marcus. They echoed in his mind as he went back to his spot under the bridge that night. They gave him strength when Brandon harassed him the next morning at the mall. They reminded him that he was more than what people saw when they looked at him. He was more than homeless, more than broken, more than invisible. He was Marcus Webb, and he had a gift to share. Sophie Miller was 28 years old and desperately trying to make a name for herself in journalism. She'd graduated from Northwestern 5 years earlier with a degree in journalism and dreams of working for the New York Times or the Washington Post. Instead, she was working for the Riverside Gazette, a local paper with a circulation of about 15,000 and a budget that made every assignment feel like a battle. But Sophie hadn't given up on her dreams. She was determined to find stories that mattered, stories that could make a difference. For the past month, Sophie had been working on a series about homelessness in Riverside. The city had seen a dramatic increase in its homeless population over the past few years, and city officials were struggling to address the crisis. Sophie had been interviewing people living on the streets, spending time at shelters, talking to social workers and advocates. She was trying to put human faces on statistics, to make people understand that homelessness wasn't a choice or a moral failing. It was a complex problem with roots in poverty, mental illness, addiction, and a broken social safety net. That's what brought her to the Riverside Mall on a Wednesday morning. She'd heard from one of her sources that mall security had been cracking down on homeless people using the public facilities. She wanted to see it for herself. She arrived at 7 a.m, camera in hand, notebook in her pocket. She bought a coffee from the Starbucks and found a bench where she could observe without being obvious. She saw Marcus immediately. He was hard to miss. A man in torn clothes sitting at a beautiful grand piano, his fingers moving gently across the keys. Sophie couldn't hear the music from where she was sitting, but she could see the concentration on his face. The way his whole body seemed to relax as he played. There was something beautiful about it, something that made her reach for her camera. She'd taken maybe 3 photos when she saw Brandon Hayes approaching. Sophie recognized him. She'd done a profile on local business owners 6 months earlier, and Brandon had been one of her interviews. He'd been polite during the interview, but she'd gotten the sense that he was the kind of person who saw everything through the lens of profit and loss. He'd talked a lot about maintaining standards and protecting the brand. Now, watching Brandon confront Marcus at the piano, Sophie felt her journalist instincts kick in. This was a story. She moved closer, keeping her camera ready. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the body language. Brandon standing over Marcus, arms crossed, face set in an expression of disgust. Marcus shrinking back, his hands pulling away from the keys, the shame and humiliation on his face. Sophie started recording video on her phone. She captured the entire interaction. Brandon's aggressive posture, his phone call to security, Marcus walking away with his head down. And then, most damning of all, she captured Brandon laughing with a colleague about taking out the trash. After Marcus left, Sophie approached Brandon. "Excuse me," she said. "Sophie Miller, Riverside Gazette. Can I ask you a few questions?" Brandon's expression immediately shifted. The contempt was replaced by a professional smile. "Of course," he said. "Always happy to talk to the press. I just watched you confront that man at the piano," Sophie said. "Can you tell me why?" Brandon's smile tightened slightly. "That man is homeless," he said. "He's been harassing customers and making them uncomfortable. We have standards here at Riverside Mall. We can't have people like that driving away business." "People like that," Sophie repeated. "You mean homeless people?" "I mean people who don't respect private property," Brandon said. "That piano is for mall patrons, not for vagrants." "The sign says anyone can play," Sophie pointed out. "Within reason," Brandon said. He was starting to look annoyed. "Look, I'm sure you understand. I run a business, a luxury business. My customers expect a certain environment. They don't want to be confronted with social problems when they're trying to shop." Sophie made notes. "So you're saying that homeless people are a social problem that should be kept hidden?" "That's not what I said," Brandon snapped. "Don't twist my words. I'm just trying to understand your position, Sophie said calmly. You saw a man playing piano. He wasn't harming anyone. He wasn't panhandling. He was just playing music. And you had him removed because his appearance didn't meet your standards. Is that accurate? Brandon stared at her for a long moment. I think we're done here, he said. He turned and walked back toward his store. Sophie watched him go, her mind already racing. She had a story here. A good story. But she needed more. She needed to talk to Marcus. She needed to understand who he was and what had brought him to that piano. She spent the rest of the morning trying to find him. She checked the area around the mall, the nearby parks, anywhere a homeless person might go. Finally, around noon, she found him sitting on a bench by the river staring at the water. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. Excuse me, she said. Are you the man who was playing piano at the mall this morning? Marcus looked up at her wary. Who's asking? My name is Sophie Miller. I'm a reporter with the Riverside Gazette. She sat down on the bench, keeping a respectful distance. I saw what happened this morning, with the man from the watch store. I'd like to hear your side of the story, if you're willing to talk. Marcus was silent for a long moment. He'd spent 3 years trying to be invisible. The last thing he wanted was attention, but something about Sophie's face, about the genuine concern in her eyes, made him feel like maybe she actually cared. Maybe she wasn't just looking for a sensational story about a homeless veteran. What do you want to know? He asked quietly. Everything Sophie said. She pulled out her notebook. Start with your name. And so Marcus told her. Not everything, not at first. But slowly, over the next hour, the story came out. His childhood in Detroit. His mother teaching him piano. Losing his parents, joining the army. Meeting Sarah. Rachel. The PTSD. Sarah's death. Losing custody of his daughter. The long slide into homelessness. The piano at the mall being the only thing that gave him hope. Sophie listened without interrupting. She took notes, but mostly she just listened. And as Marcus talked, something happened. The words started coming faster. The details started emerging. Years of pain and loss and shame came pouring out. By the end, Marcus was crying. Not sobbing, just quiet tears running down his face. I just wanted to play, he said. That's all. I just wanted to feel human again. Sophie felt her own eyes getting wet. Can I write about this? She asked. Can I tell your story? Marcus hesitated. Why? Because people need to know, Sophie said. They need to understand that homelessness isn't what they think it is. You're not lazy. You're not a failure. You're a veteran who served your country and came home broken. You're a father who lost everything. You're a human being with a gift, and you deserve to be treated with dignity. What good would it do? Marcus asked. One newspaper article isn't going to change anything. Maybe not, Sophie admitted. But it's a start. And Marcus, I think there's more to your story. I think people would want to hear you play. Really play. Not just fragments in the morning when no one's around. A real performance. Marcus shook his head. That's not going to happen. I can't. What if I could make it happen? Sophie asked. What if I could arrange a performance at the mall, on that piano? What if I could give you a chance to show everyone what you can really do? Brandon Hayes would never allow it, Marcus said. Brandon Hayes doesn't own the mall, Sophie said. Let me see what I can do. Over the next week, Sophie worked on 2 things simultaneously. First, she wrote a profile of Marcus for the Gazette. She told his story with compassion and detail, painting a picture of a talented musician brought low by circumstances beyond his control. She included quotes from Father Thomas, who praised Marcus's playing. She included the backstory about his mother, about Sarah, about Rachel. She made Marcus human. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People were moved by Marcus's story. Letters poured into the paper. Emails flooded Sophie's inbox. Several local veterans organizations reached out offering support. A crowdfunding campaign started spontaneously raising money to help Marcus get back on his feet. But not everyone was sympathetic. Brandon Hayes was furious. He saw the article as a personal attack. He called Sophie and left an angry voicemail accusing her of activist journalism and attacking successful business owners. He complained to her editor. He threatened to pull his advertising from the paper. Sophie's editor, Tom Bradley, called her into his office. Tom was 55, a veteran journalist who'd seen it all. "Good work on the Marcus Webb piece," he said. "But we've got a problem. Brandon Hayes is not happy. I reported the facts." Sophie said. "I know you did," Tom said, "and I'm backing you 100%. But Hayes is threatening to make trouble. He's got connections on the city council. He's talking about filing a complaint. Let him," Sophie said. "The story is true. Every word." "I know," Tom said. "Just wanted to give you a heads up." And Sophie, keep going. I think there's more here. If you can make something happen with that performance you mentioned in the article, that would be one hell of a follow-up. Sophie was already on it. She'd reached out to the mall management company. She'd pitched them on the idea of a special performance by Marcus Webb. She'd framed it as a public relations opportunity, a chance to show that the Riverside Mall was a community space that valued all people. She'd even gotten several local businesses to agree to sponsor the event. The mall management was hesitant at first. They were worried about Brandon Hayes' reaction. He was one of their biggest tenants, and he paid top dollar for his prime location. But the public response to Sophie's article had been so positive that they couldn't ignore it. Finally, after a week of negotiation, they agreed. Marcus could perform at the mall. One time. Sunday afternoon at 3 p.m., 2 weeks from now. When Sophie told Marcus, he went pale. "I can't," he said. "I haven't performed in front of people in over a decade. I'm not ready. I'm not good enough." "You are," Sophie insisted. "I've heard you play. Father Thomas has heard you play. You're incredible, Marcus. You just need to believe in yourself." "What if I freeze?" Marcus asked. "What if I mess up? What if I prove Brandon Hayes right?" "You won't," Sophie said. "But even if you did, it wouldn't matter. The fact that you're trying matters. The fact that you're not letting him take this away from you matters. This is your chance, Marcus. Your chance to take your life back. Your chance to show the world who you really are." Marcus was terrified. But deep down, beneath the fear, there was something else. Excitement. Hope. A tiny flame of belief that maybe, just maybe, he could do this. Maybe he could play again. Maybe he could be more than the broken man everyone saw on the street. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll do it." Sophie smiled. "Good. Now we just need to make sure you're ready. And I have an idea about that too." The idea was simple. Father Thomas would give Marcus access to the church piano every day. Marcus would practice. He would prepare. He would choose the piece he wanted to play and work on it until he could play it in his sleep. Father Thomas agreed immediately. He even found an old suit that fit Marcus reasonably well. It was from the church's donation closet, and it wasn't fancy, but it was clean, and it would do. For the next 2 weeks, Marcus practiced every day. He chose Clair de Lune by Debussy. It was his mother's favorite piece. She'd played it at his wedding. He'd played it at her funeral. It was a piece filled with emotion and memory. And it was a piece that would show everyone what he was capable of. As word spread about the upcoming performance, the tension in the mall increased. Brandon Hayes made his opposition clear. He circulated a petition among the other store owners, trying to get them to pressure mall management into canceling the event. Some signed it. Most didn't. The community was watching. This had become bigger than just one homeless man playing piano. It had become a referendum on who belonged in public spaces, on whether we treat people with dignity or dismiss them based on their circumstances. Sophie continued to write about it, building anticipation for the performance. She interviewed people who supported Marcus and people who opposed the event. She kept the story in the public eye. And slowly, inexorably, the date of the performance approached. Marcus was terrified. Every day as he practiced, he thought about backing out. Every night, lying under the bridge, he imagined all the ways he could fail. But every morning he went to St. Michael's and played. And slowly, his confidence grew. His fingers remembered. The music flowed, and Marcus started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could pull this off. The Sunday of the performance arrived. Marcus woke up under the bridge as usual, but today felt different. Today wasn't about survival. Today was about something bigger. Today, Marcus Webb was going to play piano, and everyone would be watching. To understand why Brandon Hayes reacted the way he did, you need to understand where he came from. Because Brandon's hostility toward Marcus wasn't just about maintaining standards or protecting his business. It was about something much deeper, something he'd spent his entire adult life trying to forget. Brandon Hayes was born in a trailer park on the outskirts of Riverside. His father, Carl Hayes, was a mechanic who worked at a garage downtown. Carl was good at his job when he was sober, which wasn't often. Brandon's mother left when Brandon was 6 years old. Just packed her bags one day and disappeared. No note, no explanation. She just couldn't take it anymore. The poverty, the drinking, the constant struggle. She left, and she never came back. After that, it was just Brandon and his father. Carl tried. He really did. But the demons that drove him to drink were stronger than his love for his son. Brandon grew up in chaos. Some nights, Carl would come home drunk and pass out on the couch. Other nights, he'd come home drunk and rage about everything that was wrong with his life. About the wife who left. About the bosses who didn't appreciate him. About the son who was just another burden. Brandon learned early to stay out of his father's way. He spent most of his time at the public library doing homework, reading anything he could get his hands on. The librarians took pity on him. They knew his situation. They'd see him come in after school and stay until closing time, clearly not wanting to go home. They never said anything. They just let him be. School was Brandon's escape. He was smart, much smarter than his circumstances suggested he should be. He got straight A's. He joined every club he could. He stayed late for activities. Anything to avoid going home to that trailer. His teachers noticed. Several of them tried to help, offering tutoring mentorship, even money for things like school trips and supplies. Brandon accepted the help, but he was always careful to maintain his pride. He didn't want pity. He wanted respect. When Brandon was 15, his father lost his job. Carl had shown up drunk one too many times. The garage owner who'd been patient for years finally had enough. Carl was fired. Without that steady income, the little stability Brandon's life had fell apart completely. They lost the trailer. They ended up in a homeless shelter for 6 months. Those 6 months scarred Brandon in ways he'd never fully acknowledged. The shame of being homeless. The humiliation of standing in line for food. The way people looked at them with either pity or contempt. The constant feeling of being lesser than, of being judged, of being invisible unless you were being told to move along. Brandon hated every second of it, and he swore to himself that he would never, ever be in that position again. He worked harder than ever at school. He got a part-time job at a fast food restaurant lying about his age. He saved every penny. When he turned 18, He aged out of the foster care system that had taken him in after social services finally intervened. Carl was still out there somewhere, still drinking, still barely surviving. Brandon cut off all contact. He wanted nothing to do with that life anymore. Brandon put himself through community college, working 2 jobs. He studied business. He learned about marketing finance operations. He was obsessed with understanding how wealthy people made their money, how they maintained it, how they separated themselves from people like his father. He graduated top of his class and got a job as a sales associate at a jewelry store. That's where Brandon discovered his talent. He was good at selling luxury items. He understood that people weren't just buying a product, they were buying status, identity, a story they could tell themselves about who they were. Brandon was charming when he needed to be. He was attentive. He made customers feel special. And he made a lot of money in commissions. By the time he was 25, Brandon had saved enough to make a down payment on his own business. He opened Timeless Elegance in a small shopping center. He sold watches. Not cheap watches. Luxury watches. Rolex, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet. Watches that cost more than most people made in a year. And business was good. Brandon had found his niche. Over the next decade, Brandon's business grew. He moved to larger locations. He expanded his inventory. He built a reputation as the place to go in Riverside for luxury timepieces. By the time he was 35, Brandon was successful by any measure. He had money, status, respect, everything he'd dreamed about as a kid in that trailer park. But success hadn't made Brandon happy. It had made him hard. He looked at people who were struggling, and instead of seeing himself, instead of feeling compassion, he felt contempt. Because if he could make it, if he could escape poverty and build a successful business, then anyone could. The people who didn't were just lazy. They were making excuses. They were giving up. They were weak. This was the lie Brandon told himself. Because if poverty was a choice, if homelessness was just a matter of effort, then his father's failures were his father's fault. And Brandon didn't have to feel guilty about cutting him off. He didn't have to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, there were forces beyond individual control that trapped people in cycles of poverty and despair. When Brandon looked at Marcus Webb, he saw his father. The same disheveled appearance, the same air of defeat, the same presence in a space where he clearly didn't belong. And it enraged him, because Marcus was a reminder of everything Brandon had tried to escape. Everything he'd tried to prove didn't define him. But there was something else, too. Something Brandon barely admitted to himself. When he looked at Marcus, he also saw a path he could have taken. A version of himself that hadn't fought so hard, hadn't been so lucky. Because Brandon knew deep down that his success wasn't just about hard work. There had been luck involved. The right job at the right time, the right customers, the right economy. If any number of things had gone differently, Brandon could have ended up just like Marcus. Homeless, broken, playing piano in a mall for scraps of dignity. That terrified him. So he lashed out. He turned his fear into anger and directed it at Marcus. If he could prove that Marcus was different from him, lesser than him, then he could believe that he was safe. That he'd earned his success through merit alone. That he could never end up where Marcus was. As the date of Marcus's performance approached, Brandon's anger intensified. He saw it as a personal affront. The mall was validating Marcus. They were giving him a platform. They were treating him like he mattered, and that to Brandon was unacceptable. It undermined everything Brandon believed about the world. Brandon spent the 2 weeks before the performance trying to stop it. He talked to mall management. He threatened to break his lease. He organized other store owners to complain. He even contacted his lawyer to see if there was any legal way to prevent the performance. Nothing worked. The mall was moving forward with the event. Brandon was losing control. 3 days before the performance, Brandon did something he hadn't done in 17 years. He drove to the homeless shelter where he'd stayed with his father all those years ago. He didn't know why he was going. He just felt compelled. Like there was something there he needed to confront. The shelter looked the same. Different paint, maybe, but the same depressing building, the same line of people waiting outside. Brandon parked across the street and just watched for a while. He saw families, single mothers with kids, elderly people, veterans, all of them waiting for a bed, a meal, a moment of safety. And for the first time in years, Brandon let himself remember what it felt like. The fear, the uncertainty, the constant awareness that you were one bad day away from the streets. He remembered his father passed out in one of those beds, snoring loudly while Brandon lay awake, terrified. He remembered promising himself that he'd get out, that he'd be different, that he'd never end up back here. He'd kept that promise. But at what cost? He'd built walls so high around himself that he couldn't see other people as human anymore. He'd turned empathy into contempt because empathy was dangerous. Empathy meant acknowledging that he wasn't so different from the people he looked down on, that he was lucky, not superior. Brandon sat in his car for over an hour, wrestling with thoughts and feelings he'd suppressed for decades. Finally, he drove away. But something had shifted. Not much, but enough. Enough to plant a seed of doubt about the person he'd become. The day of the performance arrived. Brandon had decided he would attend. Not to support Marcus, but to watch him fail. To prove that he was right. That people like Marcus didn't belong. That giving them platforms was a mistake. He would be there to witness the disaster, and then everyone would see that Brandon had been right all along. He arrived at the mall at 2:30, 90 minutes before the performance. The atrium was already filling with people. Sophie Miller had done her job well. There were cameras from local news stations, reporters from papers throughout the region, and hundreds of regular people who'd read about Marcus's story and wanted to be there for his comeback. Brandon pushed through the crowd to get to his store. He needed to be busy. He needed to not think about what was about to happen. But as he stood behind his counter watching the crowd grow, he couldn't help but feel something twisting in his gut, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. At 2:45, he saw Marcus arrive. Father Thomas was with him along with Sophie. Marcus was wearing that donated suit. His hair had been cut. His beard had been trimmed. He looked nervous. Terrified, actually. His hands were shaking. Brandon could see it even from 50 feet away. And in that moment, something broke inside Brandon. Because he recognized that expression. That fear. The desperate hope mixed with certainty of failure. He'd felt it himself 1,000 times. Every time he'd walked into a job interview, every time he'd pitched a client, every time he'd taken a risk on his business. That's what courage looked like. Not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it. Brandon watched as Marcus approached the piano. The crowd pressed closer. Cameras pointed. Everyone waited. This was the moment of truth. The moment when Marcus Webb would either reclaim his dignity or confirm everyone's worst assumptions about homeless people. Brandon found himself holding his breath and realized with a shock that went through him like electricity that he was hoping Marcus would succeed. That some part of him, some deeply buried part that remembered being that scared kid in the shelter, wanted to see Marcus triumph, wanted to believe that redemption was possible, that the past didn't have to define you, that you could fall and get back up. The realization shook Brandon to his core. Because if Marcus could change his story, if Marcus could reclaim his life, then maybe Brandon could too. Maybe he could let go of the bitterness and fear that had driven him for so long. Maybe he could be something more than just a success. Maybe he could be a good person. As Marcus sat down at the piano bench and placed his shaking hands on the keys, Brandon felt tears sting his eyes. He didn't understand why he was crying. He told himself it was just the emotion of the moment. The crowd. The tension. But deep down he knew. He was crying for that kid in the shelter. The one who'd been so scared and so alone. The one who'd grown up into a man who'd forgotten how to be human. Marcus took a deep breath. The crowd fell completely silent. And then Marcus began to play. The first note hung in the air like a prayer. It was soft, almost tentative, as if Marcus was testing whether the piano would accept him, whether he still had the right to create beauty. The note faded, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then Marcus played the second note, and the third. And slowly, carefully, Clair de Lune began to emerge. If you've never heard Debussy's Clair de Lune, it's hard to describe the piece adequately. The title means moonlight, and that's what it sounds like moonlight made audible, like the feeling of standing outside on a clear night and looking up at the moon and feeling both insignificant and infinite at the same time. It's a piece about beauty and melancholy, about memory and loss, about how something can be heartbreakingly sad and achingly beautiful at exactly the same moment. Marcus had chosen this piece for a reason. His mother had played it at his wedding. He'd played it at her funeral. It was woven through every important moment of his life. And now, sitting at this piano, in front of hundreds of people with cameras recording, and the man who'd tormented him watching from across the atrium, Marcus poured everything he had into those notes. At first, his hands were stiff. His fingers stumbled slightly on a trill in the third measure. Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. This was a mistake. He shouldn't be here. He was going to fail in front of everyone. He was going to prove Brandon Hayes right. But then something happened. Marcus closed his eyes. And suddenly he wasn't in the mall anymore. He was back in his mother's living room in Detroit. He was 8 years old, sitting next to her on the piano bench. She was playing Clair de Lune, and he was watching her fingers dance across the keys. She was smiling. The house smelled like the cookies she'd baked that afternoon. Outside, it was snowing. Everything was perfect and safe and warm. When Marcus opened his eyes, his hands were no longer shaking. The stiffness was gone, and the music began to flow. The transformation was extraordinary. The notes that had been hesitant and uncertain suddenly became confident. The melody swelled and retreated like waves on a shore. Marcus's whole body seemed to merge with the piano. His shoulders swayed. His head moved with the rhythm. His fingers flew across the keys with a precision and grace that spoke of thousands of hours of practice, of a lifetime of dedication to this art. The crowd stood transfixed. People who had come out of curiosity, who had maybe expected a touching but mediocre performance, found themselves witnessing something far beyond what they'd imagined. This wasn't just competent. This wasn't just good. This was extraordinary. Marcus Webb wasn't just a homeless man who could play piano. He was a pianist. A real pianist. The kind of talent that should have been on concert stages. The kind of gift that comes along once in a generation. Sophie stood at the edge of the crowd with tears streaming down her face. She was recording on her phone, but she could barely keep it steady. This was more than she'd hoped for, more than she'd imagined possible. She'd believed in Marcus, but even she hadn't understood the full extent of his talent. Watching him now, watching him transform from that scared, broken man into this magnificent artist, she felt like she was witnessing a resurrection. Father Thomas was praying quietly, thanking God for this moment, asking for blessings on this beautiful, broken soul who'd found his way back to the music. The old priest had seen a lot in his 73 years. He'd seen war and death and suffering, but he'd also seen grace. And grace was what this was. Pure, unfiltered grace. As the piece progressed through its middle section, Marcus began to play with even more emotion. This was the part of Clair de Lune that builds in intensity. The melody becomes more complex, the harmonies richer, the technical demands greater. Marcus's hands moved faster, his fingers finding notes that seemed impossible to reach, and the sound that emerged was almost overwhelming in its beauty. People in the crowd were crying openly now. Not just Sophie and Father Thomas. Dozens of people. Tough men who hadn't cried in years. Teenagers who thought they were too cool for emotions. Elderly women who'd seen everything life had to offer and thought nothing could move them anymore. They all stood there with tears running down their faces, unable to look away, unable to process what they were experiencing. Because what Marcus was playing wasn't just music, it was pain. It was every loss he'd suffered, every night sleeping under that bridge, every morning waking up and wondering if today would be the day he gave up. It was Sarah's death. It was Rachel's face the day social services took her away. It was his mother's funeral. It was the weight of every single moment of suffering compressed into sound. But it was also hope. It was beauty persisting in the face of horror. It was the stubborn refusal to give up even when giving up would be so much easier. It was the tiny flame of humanity that Marcus had managed to keep alive despite everything the world had done to extinguish it. And somehow, impossibly miraculously, Marcus was making everyone in that mall feel what he felt. He was sharing his pain and his hope and his humanity through his fingertips. Brandon Hayes stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. Tears were pouring down his face, and he didn't care who saw. His carefully constructed worldview was crumbling with every note Marcus played. Because this wasn't a homeless person playing piano. This was a human being expressing his soul, and it was more beautiful and more painful than anything Brandon had ever experienced. All of Brandon's certainties, all of his judgments, all of his carefully rationalized contempt felt suddenly ridiculous. Who was he to say that Marcus didn't belong? Marcus belonged here more than anyone, because Marcus had something real, something genuine, something that couldn't be bought or sold or put on display in a luxury store. Marcus had survived. He'd endured. And he'd kept his gift alive. Brandon thought about his father, Carl Hayes, the mechanic who drank too much. Carl Hayes, who'd lost everything and couldn't find his way back. Carl Hayes, who Brandon had dismissed as weak, as a failure, as someone who deserved what he got. And Brandon realized with a clarity that felt like a physical blow that he'd been wrong. His father hadn't been weak. His father had been broken. There was a difference. And Brandon had been too afraid, too wrapped up in his own fear of ending up the same way to see it. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Marcus's playing became even more transcendent. This was the part of Clair de Lune that resolves, where all the tension and complexity simplifies into something pure and simple and heartbreakingly beautiful. The melody becomes gentle again. The tempo slows. Everything quiets down to a whisper. It's like watching the sun set, like saying goodbye to someone you love, like accepting that some things end, and that's okay. Marcus's hands slowed. The notes became softer, gentler. He was playing so quietly now that people in the back of the crowd had to strain to hear. But nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. They all stood perfectly still, afraid that even breathing too loudly would shatter this perfect, fragile moment. And then Marcus played the final note, a single, pure tone that hung in the air for what seemed like forever, and then faded, Gone. Silence. Complete and absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if the entire mall had been frozen in time. Marcus sat with his hands still on the keys, his eyes closed, his whole body trembling. He'd poured everything into that performance, every ounce of energy, every emotion, every memory. He felt completely empty, completely exposed, completely vulnerable. And then from somewhere in the crowd, someone started clapping. One person, then another, then suddenly everyone. The applause wasn't polite, it wasn't restrained, it was explosive, thunderous. People were clapping and crying and shouting. Some were on their feet. Others were just standing there with their hands pressed to their mouths, unable to believe what they'd just witnessed. Marcus opened his eyes. He looked out at the crowd, and for the first time in 3 years, he saw people looking back at him. Really looking. Not through him, not past him, but at him. Seeing him. Acknowledging him. Respecting him. And then something happened that Marcus hadn't expected. Couldn't have expected. The crowd began to part. People moved aside, creating a path. And through that path, walking slowly, tentatively, came a teenage girl. She was 15 years old, tall and thin, with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. She had Marcus's eyes, Sarah's smile. Rachel. Marcus stood up from the piano bench so fast he almost knocked it over. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Rachel was here. His daughter was here. Wow. Why when? Rachel walked toward him, and as she got closer, Marcus could see that she was crying. Her face was wet with tears, but she was also smiling. She stopped about 5 feet away from him, and for a long moment, father and daughter just stared at each other. 5 years. It had been 5 years since they'd seen each other. 5 years since that terrible day when social services had taken her away. "Dad," Rachel said. Her voice cracked on the word. Marcus couldn't speak. He wanted to say so many things. To apologize, to explain, to tell her how much he loved her, and how sorry he was for letting her down. But no words would come. He just stood there shaking, crying, unable to believe this was real. Rachel closed the distance between them. She threw her arms around her father and held on tight. Marcus wrapped his arms around her and held on like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth, which in that moment she was. "I'm so sorry," Marcus finally managed to choke out. "Rachel, I'm so sorry." "I know," Rachel whispered into his shoulder. "I know, Dad. It's okay. I'm here. They stood like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. The crowd watched in respectful silence, giving them this moment. Many people were crying harder now than they had during the performance. Because this wasn't just about music anymore. This was about family, about redemption. about love persisting even when everything else falls apart. Sophie was crying so hard she could barely see. She'd done this. She'd contacted Rachel through the foster care system. She'd explained what was happening. She'd arranged for Rachel's foster parents to bring her to the performance. It had been a risk. She hadn't told Marcus because she didn't want to get his hopes up if it didn't work out. But it had worked out. It had worked out better than she could have possibly imagined. Father Thomas was openly weeping, praising God, thanking Jesus, asking for blessings on this beautiful moment. This was why he'd become a priest, not for the theology or the rituals, but for moments like this, moments when you could actually see grace made manifest in the world. And Brandon Hayes stood there and watched and felt something inside him finally irrevocably break. All the anger and fear and contempt he'd built up over the years cracked and crumbled. He'd been so wrong, so completely, utterly wrong. About Marcus, about homeless people, about what mattered in life. He'd spent decades chasing success and status, trying to prove he was better than his father, better than where he came from. And what had it gotten him? An empty life, a cold heart, a soul that had forgotten how to feel. Watching Marcus and Rachel embrace Brandon realized that Marcus had something he didn't, something that all the money and success in the world couldn't buy. Marcus had love. He had his daughter back. He had people who believed in him. He had a community that had rallied around him. Marcus, who'd lost everything, had more than Brandon, who'd gained everything. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. Brandon knew in that moment that he had to change. He didn't know how. He didn't know if he could. But he knew he had to try. Because if Marcus could come back from where he'd been, then maybe Brandon could too. Maybe it wasn't too late to become someone better, someone kinder, someone more human. The crowd began to disperse slowly. People came up to Marcus to shake his hand, to tell him how moved they were, to offer support. Local news crews conducted interviews. Sophie stayed close, making sure Marcus was okay, making sure this wasn't too overwhelming. Rachel stayed glued to her father's side, as if afraid that if she let go, he might disappear again. And in all the chaos and emotion and celebration, something beautiful was happening. A community was forming around Marcus Webb, not to save him or fix him or make him a project, but to support him, to see him, to acknowledge his worth as a human being, because that's what his performance had done. It had reminded everyone that homeless people aren't statistics or problems or eyesores. They're people, people with gifts and stories and value. Marcus's performance had lasted just over 8 minutes. 8 minutes to play Claire de Lune. But in those 8 minutes, Marcus had changed hundreds of lives, including his own, most especially his own. The video of Marcus's performance went viral within hours. Sophie had posted it to social media, and it spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 10 million times. Within a week, it had reached 50 million. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Marcus Webb, the homeless veteran who'd played piano in a mall and brought an entire community to tears, became a national sensation. The attention was overwhelming. Marcus's phone, which Sophie had helped him get, rang constantly with requests for interviews. Morning shows wanted him on. Talk shows made offers. A documentary filmmaker reached out about doing a full-length film. Record labels expressed interest in producing an album. The offers came so fast and so numerous that Marcus couldn't process them all. But more important than the media attention was the practical help. The crowdfunding campaign that had started after Sophie's initial article exploded after the performance. Over $300,000 poured in from people all over the world who'd been moved by Marcus's story, Local veterans organizations coordinated to provide Marcus with housing, health care, and job placement services. The VA finally reached out with offers of assistance for his PTSD treatment. Within 2 weeks of the performance, Marcus had an apartment. It was small, just a studio on the 3rd floor of an old building. But it was his. He had a key. He had a door that locked. He had a bed and a bathroom and a kitchen. After 3 years of sleeping under a bridge, it felt like a palace. The apartment came furnished with donated items from the community. People gave him dishes, linens, a couch, a television. And in the corner, in the place of honor, sat an upright piano. Not a Steinway. Not anything fancy. But a decent instrument that held its tune. It had been donated by a local music school. Marcus cried when it was delivered. He sat down immediately and played for 3 hours straight. Rachel started visiting every weekend. Her foster parents, Tom and Linda Martinez, were supportive. They'd seen the performance. They understood the bond between Marcus and Rachel. They didn't try to keep them apart. Instead, they facilitated the relationship, driving Rachel to Riverside, staying nearby in case she needed them, but giving father and daughter space to reconnect. Those first visits were awkward. 5 years was a long time. Rachel was 15 now, almost an adult. Marcus had missed so much of her life. Her first day of high school, her first dance, her first heartbreak. There was a canyon of lost time between them that couldn't be crossed in a few afternoons. But slowly, gradually, they found their way back to each other. They talked about Sarah, about the past, about what had happened. Marcus apologized over and over, but Rachel always stopped him. "You were sick, Dad," she said. "You didn't choose to be sick. You didn't choose to lose Mom. You did the best you could." Marcus wasn't sure he believed that, but he wanted to. He wanted to forgive himself the way Rachel seemed to have forgiven him. It would take time. Maybe years. Maybe forever. But at least now, he had the chance to try. Marcus also started treatment for his PTSD. A therapist who specialized in working with veterans began seeing him twice a week. The sessions were hard. They forced Marcus to confront memories and emotions he'd been running from for years, but they were also necessary. Marcus was tired of running. He was tired of being controlled by his past. He wanted to heal, even though healing was painful. 3 weeks after the performance, Brandon Hayes walked into Marcus's apartment. It was a Sunday afternoon. Rachel wasn't there. Marcus was alone practicing piano when he heard the knock. He opened the door and was shocked to see Brandon standing there holding a bag from a local deli. "Can I come in?" Brandon asked. His voice was different than Marcus remembered, softer, less certain. Marcus hesitated. Every interaction he'd had with Brandon had been hostile. Why would he show up now? But something in Brandon's face made Marcus step aside. "Sure," he said. Brandon came in and looked around the small apartment. "This is nice," he said. "Better than, you deserve this." "What do you want?" Brandon Marcus asked. He wasn't angry, just confused. Brandon set the bag on the counter. "I brought lunch," he said. "If you're hungry, sandwiches. I didn't know what you liked, so I got a couple options." Marcus didn't move. "Why are you here?" Brandon took a deep breath. "To apologize," he said. He looked Marcus in the eye. "I was terrible to you. I said things that were cruel and unfair. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I'm sorry." Marcus sat down slowly on the couch. "Okay," he said. He didn't know what else to say. Brandon sat down too, keeping a respectful distance. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. "About why I acted the way I did?" Marcus nodded, and Brandon told him. about his childhood, about his father, about being homeless, about the years of fear and shame that had shaped him into someone hard and cold, about how looking at Marcus had reminded him of everything he'd tried to escape, about how that had terrified him. When I saw you perform, Brandon said something broke in me. I realized I'd been wrong about everything. About you. About homeless people. About what makes someone valuable. He paused. I called my father. First time in 17 years. We talked for 2 hours. It was difficult, but necessary. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Brandon finished, Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me that." "I know an apology doesn't fix what I did," Brandon said, "but I wanted you to know that I'm trying to be better. I've started volunteering at the homeless shelter. I'm donating to veterans organizations. I'm trying to use my position to help instead of hurt." "That's good," Marcus said. "And I wanted to offer you something." Brandon continued. He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Marcus. "No strings attached. I don't want recognition or credit. I just want to help." Marcus opened the envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000. Marcus stared at it. "Brandon, I can't." "Yes, you can," Brandon said. "You need to get fully back on your feet. This can help with that. Maybe get you a car, cover expenses while you figure out what's next. Whatever you need." "Why?" Marcus asked. Brandon met his eyes. "Because you showed me something I'd forgotten. That people matter. That everyone deserves dignity and a chance at redemption. You gave me that, Marcus. You changed my life. This is just me trying to return the favor." Marcus didn't know what to say. The check represented more money than he'd seen in years. It represented security, options, a future. "Thank you," he finally said. Brandon stood up. "I should go. But Marcus, if you ever need anything, you can call me. I mean that." After Brandon left, Marcus sat holding the check for a long time. He thought about how strange life was, how the man who'd tormented him had become in an unexpected way a benefactor, how hatred could transform into something resembling friendship, or at least mutual respect, how everyone, even people like Brandon Hayes, was capable of change. 6 months after the performance, Marcus's life had settled into something resembling normal. He was still in the same apartment, still seeing his therapist twice a week, still attending support groups for veterans with PTSD. Rachel visited every weekend, and their relationship had deepened. They were planning for her to spend summer vacation with him. Her foster parents had agreed, and social services was supportive. There was even talk of Marcus eventually regaining custody, though everyone agreed to take it slow. Marcus had turned down most of the media offers. He didn't want to be famous. He didn't want to be a celebrity. But he had accepted one opportunity that felt right. He was now teaching piano to children of veterans at a local community center. The program was free, funded by donations from people who'd been moved by his story. Marcus taught 3 afternoons a week, working with kids who, like him, had been touched by war and its aftermath. It was rewarding work. Marcus loved seeing the kids' faces light up when they mastered a new piece. He loved being able to pass on what his mother had given him. He loved that something good was coming from all the pain he'd endured. The music continued. The gift continued. The legacy continued. Marcus still played at St. Michael's every Sunday. Father Thomas would sit in the pews and listen sometimes, crying, always moved. The church had become Marcus's musical home, the place where he felt most at peace, the place where he could play not for an audience, but for himself, for the pure joy of making music. Marcus had also reconnected with some of his old army buddies. They'd seen the viral video and reached out. Some were doing well. Others were struggling like Marcus had been. They formed a support group meeting once a month to talk share experiences and help each other navigate the challenges of post-military life. It helped Marcus to know he wasn't alone, that other people understood what he'd been through. Life wasn't perfect. Marcus still had bad days when the PTSD overwhelmed him, days when the grief over Sarah hit him like a physical blow, days when he doubted whether he deserved the second chance he'd been given. But those days were becoming less frequent. And on the good days, Marcus could see a future, a real future. One with Rachel and music and purpose. The performance at the mall had changed everything, but not in the way Marcus initially thought. It wasn't the fame or the money or the media attention that mattered. It was the moment when Marcus had proven to himself that he was still human, still had value, still mattered. Everything else that came after was just confirmation of what he'd discovered in those 8 minutes at the piano. That he was Marcus Webb, that he had a gift, that he deserved to exist in the world. There's a temptation to look at Marcus Webb's story and see it as a fairy tale. Homeless veteran gets discovered, goes viral. Life transforms overnight. It's a neat narrative, an inspiring story, the kind of thing we like to share on social media because it makes us feel good about humanity. But the truth is more complicated than that. Marcus's story isn't really about the performance or the viral video or the media attention. It's about something much simpler and much more profound. It's about a man who refused to give up, who held on to the one thing that made him feel human even when everything else had been taken away, who had the courage to sit at a piano and play despite knowing that people would judge him, mock him, reject him. Marcus's transformation didn't happen in those 8 minutes when he played Claire de Lune. It happened over 3 years of waking up every morning under a bridge and choosing to live. It happened in those quiet moments at 5 a.m. when he touched the piano keys and remembered who he used to be. It happened in the conversations with Father Thomas and Sophie, and eventually Rachel. It happened slowly, painfully, incrementally. The performance was just the moment when everyone else finally saw what Marcus had been building inside himself all along. And that's the real lesson of this story, that human beings are resilient in ways we can't fully comprehend. That people who look broken on the outside might be fighting battles and maintaining dignity in ways we can't see. That everyone, absolutely everyone, deserves to be treated with respect and given opportunities to show their worth. Marcus's story also reminds us that judgment is easy and understanding is hard. Brandon Hayes judged Marcus based on his appearance, his circumstances, his position in life. He made assumptions that fit his worldview and protected his ego. It took witnessing Marcus's humanity expressed through music to break through those assumptions. How many other people do we judge every day without ever seeing their humanity? How many Marcus Webbs do we walk past without noticing? The homeless man you see on the street corner has a story. The person panhandling outside the grocery store was someone's child, someone's friend, possibly someone's parent. They had dreams once. They had talents. They had moments of joy and love and hope. Life broke them in ways we might never understand. And they're still human, still worthy of dignity, still deserving of compassion. 1 year after the performance, Marcus stood in his apartment with Rachel. They'd spent the afternoon together, talking and laughing and making up for lost time. Now it was evening, and Rachel needed to get back to the Martinez's house. They stood at the door, reluctant to say goodbye. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Rachel said. She'd said it before, but it still made Marcus's eyes water every time. "I'm proud of you too," Marcus replied. You're stronger than I ever was." "I got it from you," Rachel said. "The strength. Mom always said you were the strongest person she knew, that you could survive anything." "I almost didn't," Marcus admitted. "There were days I wanted to give up. But you didn't," Rachel said. "That's what matters." After Rachel left, Marcus sat down at his piano. He placed his hands on the keys and thought about how far he'd come. From that bridge to this apartment. From being invisible to being seen. From having nothing to having everything that truly mattered. He began to play. Not Claire de Lune this time. Something different. A piece he was composing himself. He called it Rachel's Song. It was still rough, still needed work. But it was beautiful. It was hopeful. It was about new beginnings and second chances, and love that persists even when everything else falls apart. As Marcus played, he thought about his mother. About Sarah. About all the people who'd believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. About Sophie and Father Thomas, and even strangely Brandon Hayes. About the community that had rallied around him. About the second chance he'd been given. And he thought about all the other people out there who were still under bridges, still sleeping in shelters, still fighting to maintain their humanity in a world that told them they were worthless. Marcus couldn't save them all. He couldn't even save most of them. But he could keep teaching piano to kids who needed it. He could keep sharing his story when asked. He could keep being a reminder that homeless people are people. That everyone has value, that redemption is always possible. The music flowed from Marcus's fingers. It filled his small apartment. It drifted out the window into the evening air. And somewhere out there, someone walking past might have heard it, might have paused for a moment, might have thought about the person playing and the story behind the music, might have been reminded that beauty can come from the most unexpected places. Because that's what Marcus Webb had proven. That the most beautiful music sometimes comes from the most broken instruments. That pain and loss can be transformed into art. That falling down doesn't mean you can't get back up. That as long as you're breathing, as long as you have even one thing that makes you feel human, there's hope. Marcus played until his fingers were tired and his heart was full. Then he stopped, closed the piano lid, and sat in the peaceful silence of his home. His home. He had a home. He had a daughter. He had a purpose. He had a life. The journey wasn't over. There would be hard days ahead. Setbacks and struggles and moments of doubt. But Marcus Webb was no longer invisible. He was no longer broken beyond repair. He was no longer the man under the bridge. He was Marcus Webb, was pianist, teacher, father, veteran, survivor, human being. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Sometimes the most profound truths are the simplest ones. Everyone deserves dignity. Everyone deserves a chance. Everyone has value. And sometimes all it takes is one moment, one performance, one outstretched hand to change everything. Marcus Webb got his moment. And he made sure that moment mattered. Not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever felt invisible. Everyone who'd ever been dismissed. Everyone who'd ever needed to be reminded that they're human beings worthy of love and respect. The story that started with a homeless man being mocked for touching a piano ended with a community transformed, a family reunited, and a man redeemed. Not because of magic or luck or some miraculous intervention, but because of courage, because of perseverance, because of the stubborn human refusal to give up even when giving up would be so much easier. That's the real story of Marcus Webb. Not the viral video, or the media attention, or the happy ending, but the quiet daily choice to keep going, to keep playing, to keep believing that somewhere, somehow, things could get better. And for Marcus, they did. They really did.